So in this particular lecture, let's work on retrieving all the expenses and displaying them up over here on this page. So in order to retrieve the expenses, first of all, we have to go inside the views.py file and kind of get all the expenses as objects. So right up over here in the index view, right now we only have access to the expense form, but we don't have access to expenses. So in order to get access to expenses, there's one simple line of code which we need to write, and that is we simply need to say expenses equals expense, which is the expense model. So expense dot objects dot all, and that's actually going to get all the expense objects from the expense model. But right now we also do not have the expense model imported here, so therefore I would type in from dot models. I would say I want to import the expense. So now once we have the expense model, we extracted all the objects from there, we have saved it into this expenses, and we could finally pass in those expenses up over here. So here I would say expenses and then simply pass in expenses here. Now once the expenses are passed as the context to the index.html, let's go ahead and let's try retrieving those expenses here. So right where this form ends, so this form starts here, it ends here. So just as we have a header over here which says this is an index page, let's create another header up over here in the index.html, and let's say this thing says something like expenses. So here I would create a div and I would say expenses. And in order to retrieve those actual expenses, I will loop through the expenses context. So here I would say for expense, that means a single expense in expenses. So expenses is a list of objects which we have passed. Let's type in n for, and in here for now let's just simply display the expenses and see the kind of result we would get. And here if I say expense and if I go back to the browser and hit refresh, this is what I get. So I get the expenses which are made, because if you go right up inside the models, you will be able to see that we have this str method which returns self.name. And if I want to get the cost associated with that expense, I simply have to say expense.amount. So in here inside the templates, if I say expense.amount, if I go back to the browser, you'll be able to see that I now have the cost of those expenses here. And now you could also go ahead and kind of print them up all together. So I could say expense.name, expense.amount, expense.category. And then finally I could say expense dot the date, because date is nothing but when the expense was made. So now if I go back, as you can see, now I have all that info displayed up over here. Now our job is to go ahead and display this particular information in a tabular format or in a card-like format up over here inside of a table. So let's learn how to do that in the next one.